right now, like without even realizing it, you are running on 2,500-year-old software.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every time you argue with your boss, or, every time you decide what to buy at the grocery store, or even when you just scroll through your social media feed and feel that pang of envy or outrage.
Yeah, that outrage is real.
Right. Your brain is basically executing lines of code that were written by a dead Greek guy, or a Chinese bureaucrat, or a depressed 19th century German.
Which is just a wild thing to wrap your head around.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Today, we were doing a custom-tailored deep dive into basically the ultimate story of human thought.
Yeah.
We're tracing the intellectual landscape that shaped literally everything about how we perceive reality.
Exactly.
And the most incredible, almost hilarious part about the expansive historical overview we're using as our source material today. It was originally designed as a video to help people fall asleep.
I know, it's a profound irony, right? A project designed to induce unconsciousness actually maps out the entire awakening of human consciousness. But, I mean, our goal here isn't to put you to sleep. We want to wake you up to the architecture of your own mind. Because we tend to view history, especially philosophy, as this static progression of isolated geniuses.
Right, like marble busts sitting on pedestals in a vacuum.
Exactly. But when you look at the primary sources, you realize it's a fiercely alive, continuous chain reaction. Every philosopher is essentially inheriting a broken system, looking at the unresolved bugs left by the generation before them, and trying to write a patch.
And I want you, the listener, to imagine yourself as the third person sitting right here at the table with us. We're going to trace this unbroken thread from early humans staring up at the stars, trying to figure out what fire is, all the way to our modern late-night anxieties about artificial intelligence and simulated realities.
It's a massive journey.
It is. And as we go through this, I want you to ask yourself, which philosophical patch am I operating on? Because to understand the modern code, we have to look at the very first operating system humanity ever booted up.
Right. Before we could even ask how to live a good life, we had to figure out what the world actually is.
Yeah.
And that transition is the monumental shift from myth to method. If you place yourself in the mind of an early human, the world is terrifyingly unpredictable.
Oh, absolutely.
The crops fail, lightning strikes, plagues sweep through a village. The natural human instinct is to ask, well, who is doing this?
Right, like, which god is angry at me?
Exactly. And the answers we formulated were myths. Giant eggs hatching the cosmos, pantheons of gods battling in the clouds. I mean, these are incredibly powerful narratives that gave communities a sense of control and meaning.
But then, around the 6th century BCE, in this bustling port city of Miletus, you have this guy named Thales who decides to completely change the question.
He really does.
He looks at rocks and rivers and the weather, and instead of asking who made the world, he asks what the world is made of.
Yeah.
And Thales decides that the fundamental substance of the entire universe is water.
Which, to a modern ear, claiming everything is made of water sounds primitive.
It sounds kind of childish, honestly.
It does. But the specific answer Thales gave is far less important than the cognitive leap he made to get there. Consider his environment, right? Miletus was surrounded by the sea. Water is visibly transforming all the time. It evaporates into air. It freezes into solid ice. It sustains every living plant and animal.
Oh, I see.
So Thales observed a natural phenomenon and extrapolated a universal rule without appealing to a sea god like Poseidon. He sought a natural cause for a natural world. That is the birth of the scientific instinct.
Wow. It's the moment humanity starts trusting observation over legend. And once that door opens, you get thinkers like Pythagoras.
Yes, Pythagoras.
Most of us just associate him with, like, the triangle theorem from geometry class.
Right, a lot of high school trauma there.
Exactly. But Pythagoras was doing something much more profound with music. He was plucking strings of different lengths and noticed something wild. The notes followed consistent, predictable mathematical ratios.
It's fascinating.
If you take a string and cut its length exactly in half, the pitch jumps up an exact, perfect octave.
And if we pull back and look at the implication of that discovery, Pythagoras is moving philosophy away from physical substances like water and toward invisible structures. He believed that numbers weren't just a way to measure the universe. Numbers were the underlying reality of the cosmos. Order, balance, and harmony were literally baked into the fabric of existence.
Which feels very orderly and comforting. But then, around 500 BCE, Heraclitus walks in and shatters that comfort.
He really did.
He looks at the world and says, nothing stays the same. Everything flows.
Yeah.
You cannot step into the same river twice because by the second time, new water has flowed in, and frankly, you're a slightly different person too.
Right.
He saw a universe defined by constant, relentless change. But it wasn't chaotic. He argued that this change was governed by a hidden, rational principle he called the logos.
And this introduces a massive intellectual crisis. Because almost immediately you have Parmenides reacting to Heraclitus with one of the most radical claims in early human thought.
Oh boy.
Parmenides argues that change is a complete illusion.
Okay, I have to push back here.
I figured you might.
I mean, if Parmenides thinks change is an illusion, how does he explain the literal physical reality of my everyday life? If I eat an apple, the apple is gone. It changed from being an apple to being energy in my body. Or, like, a house is built from a pile of wood. That is change.
Parmenides would argue that your senses are simply lying to you.
Lying.
Yes. His logic works like this. Something cannot come from nothing. If something exists right now, it must have always existed in some form.
Right.
Therefore, real change, which would require something becoming what it previously was not or coming out of nothingness, is logically impossible. Reality, at its foundational level, has to be one continuous, unchanging, eternal whole.
So he's saying that if my eyes tell me the apple is gone, but logic tells me matter can't just disappear, I should trust the logic and ignore my eyes.
Precisely. Parmenides forces us to confront a terrifying possibility. Our physical senses are profoundly flawed. This tension between the world we experience and the world logic dictates necessitates the invention of the rigorous scientific method. If you can't trust what you see, you have to build systems of reason to find the truth.
Which brings us to Democritus. He looks at Parmenides, who says nothing changes, and he looks at Heraclitus, who says everything changes. And Democritus manages to synthesize both of them by essentially inventing the concept of early Lego blocks.
It's such an elegant solution. Democritus proposes that the universe consists of an infinite number of tiny, invisible, uncuttable blocks called atomos, or atoms, swirling through an empty void.
So Parmenides is right because the individual atoms themselves never change. They're eternal.
Right.
But Heraclitus is right because those atoms are constantly clicking together and breaking apart to form new shapes. Trees, rocks, apples, humans. We experience the rearrangement as change. It's brilliant. But there's a glaring problem that these early thinkers quickly ran into. You can figure out that the universe is made of atoms. But understanding atomic structure doesn't stop your neighboring city-state from invading and burning your house down.
Exactly. Defining the physical world is completely useless if the human world is collapsing into chaos. Philosophy had to pivot from abstract physics to urgent, practical survival. They needed blueprints for society.
And while the Greeks were looking at the stars and debating the void, ancient thinkers in China and India were trying to stop empires from bleeding to death.
Yes.
Let's look at China in the 6th century BCE. You have Confucius. He's living through a period of immense social fracturing and war. He looks at the violence and decides the ultimate solution is repairing human relationships through ritual.
Confucius viewed a healthy society as a beautifully tuned musical instrument. For the music to play, every string needs to have the correct tension. He mapped out 5 core relationships: ruler to subject, parent to child, husband to wife, elder sibling to younger, and friend to friend. But the mechanism that keeps these relationships functioning is Lai, which we often translate as ritual.
But it's not just grand religious ceremonies, right?
Yeah.
Lai is like the everyday stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It is the etiquette of daily life. How you greet someone, how you serve tea, how you mourn the dead.
Right.
Confucius believed that by repeatedly performing these outward rituals of respect, you cultivate Ren, which is an inner, shared humaneness or kindness. If everyone simply played their specific societal role with absolute integrity, the state would naturally harmonize without the need for brutal enforcement.
But Confucius wasn't the only one with a blueprint. Laozi, the foundational figure of Taoism, writes the Tao Te Ching and takes a completely different approach.
A very different approach.
He argues that the more rules and rituals you impose, the more you disrupt the natural order. Laozi introduces the concept of the Tao, or the Way, which is the natural, unforced rhythm of the universe.
And to align with the Tao, Laozi advocates for Wu Wei, which translates to non-action or effortless action.
Which doesn't mean just lying on the couch doing nothing, right?
No, not at all.
It's more like being in a flow state.
Yeah.
If Confucius is the guy at the party trying to rigidly choreograph the entire dance floor, telling everyone exactly where to step, Laozi is the person effortlessly flowing with the music, adapting to the rhythm without forcing it.
That's a great analogy.
He said we should be like water, soft and yielding, yet capable of carving through solid rock over time.
It's a beautiful philosophy of adaptation. But when you are trying to govern a massive, rebellious population, flowing like water isn't always practical.
Yeah, I can see that.
This brings in the legalists, most notably Han Feizi. The legalists were essentially the strict bouncers at this metaphorical club.
They took one look at human nature and assumed the absolute worst.
They really did. They operated on the assumption that humans are fundamentally self-interested and will naturally cause trouble if left to their own devices.
So no flowing with the music for them.
For a legalist, preaching about virtue or effortless flow is dangerously naive. A stable society doesn't require good people. It requires a flawless system of strict laws, transparent rewards, and terrifyingly harsh punishments.
Wow.
You don't ask people to be moral. You just make the cost of breaking the law so unimaginably high that people become predictable.
It's a completely cynical, mechanical view of society. And as a total contrast to the legalists, you have the Mohists, founded by Mosi.
Yes, the Mohists.
They argued for something radical, universal, impartial care. Mosi believed that the root of all war and suffering was partiality. The fact that we care more about our own family and our own nation than we do about strangers.
Right.
He argued you should treat a random person on the street with the exact same level of devotion you show your own parents.
It is an incredibly demanding ethical standard, and frankly, a standard that proved almost impossible to enforce at scale. But the idea that philosophy could mandate radical compassion did find a foothold.
Oh, really?
Look at the Mauryan Empire in India during the 3rd century BCE. Emperor Ashoka fights the Kalinga War, a conflict of staggering brutality. He wins, but when he walks the battlefield and sees the hundreds of thousands of dead and suffering, he undergoes a profound psychological break.
He practically uninvents his own militaristic empire.
He does.
Ashoka converts to Buddhism and decides to govern through Dhamma, which translates to righteous or ethical living. And he doesn't just write it in a scroll. He literally carves these edicts of compassion, religious tolerance, and nonviolence into massive stone pillars all across his empire, some of which are still standing today.
Ashoka demonstrates that philosophical ideals aren't confined to theoretical debates. They can be codified into the operating system of a massive state.
That's incredible.
But as empires in the East were testing these grand societal systems, philosophy back in ancient Greece was zooming in on the individual mind. And that shift is catalyzed entirely by one man, Socrates.
Socrates is such a fascinating figure because he didn't write a single word down. We only know him through his students.
Right, mostly Plato.
He just wandered around the markets of Athens, walking up to powerful people and asking them deeply annoying, probing questions to expose the fact that they didn't actually know what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, did Socrates' method of aggressive questioning essentially invent modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or was he just history's first intellectual troll?
I think the Athenians who sentenced him to death certainly viewed him as a troll.
Fair point.
But his goal was genuinely therapeutic. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. He believed that true wisdom doesn't start with accumulating facts. It starts with acknowledging the limits of your own knowledge. Admitting your ignorance is the prerequisite for discovering truth.
But his star pupil, Plato, wasn't satisfied with just asking questions. Plato wanted to build a concrete map of reality.
Yes, he did.
And he does this by claiming that the physical world we are walking around in right now is essentially low resolution. He proposed the theory of forms.
To understand Plato's forms, you have to imagine that everything in our physical world is a flawed, decaying copy of a perfect, eternal blueprint that exists in a higher, non-physical realm.
Okay, so if I build a chair in my garage, one leg might be slightly shorter, the wood might splinter, it's an imperfect object.
Exactly.
But Plato says my mind only recognizes it as a chair because my soul remembers the ultimate abstract form of chairness from this higher realm.
Yes. For Plato, the physical world is just a realm of shifting shadows. The philosopher's job is to intellectually climb out of the sensory world and apprehend these pure, perfect forms: truth, beauty, justice.
But then Plato's own student, Aristotle, steps in and brings everyone crashing back down to earth.
He really grounds things.
Aristotle looks at this abstract realm of perfect forms and says, no, this is overcomplicating things. For Aristotle, knowledge has to start with what we can touch, observe, and categorize.
Aristotle was the ultimate pragmatist. To explain why anything exists in the physical world, he developed the 4 causes. Let's use your example of building a wooden chair. The material cause is what it is made of, the wood. The formal cause is its design or shape. The efficient cause is the agent who made it you, the carpenter. And most importantly, the final cause is its purpose to be sat upon.
Right. Aristotle believed everything in nature has a final cause, a built-in purpose. An acorn's purpose is to become an oak tree. And a human's purpose is to achieve eudaimonia, which usually gets translated as happiness, but it really means a state of total flourishing.
And how do we achieve that flourishing? Aristotle argues we must cultivate virtue by finding the golden mean.
Golden mean?
Right. He observed that every virtue is simply the perfect balance between two destructive extremes. Courage is the mean between the extreme of cowardice and the extreme of recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wasteful extravagance.
It's amazing how much that parallels what was happening in the East. You have Confucius advocating for the middle path of ritual harmony, and Aristotle in Greece arguing for the balanced golden mean.
It's a striking similarity.
They both realized that an extreme life is an unstable life. But here is the terrifying variable they couldn't account for. What happens when you perfectly cultivate your virtues? You find the golden mean, you build a balanced society, and a plague wipes out your family anyway.
Or a foreign army enslaves your city.
Exactly. When the external world becomes a nightmare of chaos that you cannot control, grand societal blueprints lose their comfort. You need a way to protect your mind.
This is the critical transition from societal philosophy to psychological survival. In the wake of the Greek Golden Age, Alexander the Great's empire fragments, and the Mediterranean world descends into uncertainty.
It was a chaotic time.
In response, we see the rise of the Hellenistic schools, which were essentially philosophies of mental armor.
Take the Cynics, for example. Diogenes is the most famous Cynic, and he looked at the pursuit of wealth, status, and polite society and declared it all a ridiculous, fragile game.
He really despised the elite.
He lived in a large clay jar in the marketplace, owning essentially nothing, and aggressively mocked the rich elites who walked by. He wanted to prove that you do not need external luxury to be happy. In fact, relying on luxury makes you weak because it can be taken away.
The Cynics sought radical self-sufficiency. Then you have the Epicureans. Today, if you call someone an epicure, it usually implies they love expensive wine and lavish multi-course meals.
Right, like a foodie.
But Epicurus himself would have hated that. He advocated for minimizing suffering by focusing on simple, easily attainable pleasures, a bowl of plain food, a quiet garden, and conversation with good friends.
Epicurus was doing a calculus of pain. If you desire massive wealth, you might get it, but you'll suffer constant anxiety trying to keep it.
Exactly.
If you desire only water and bread, your desires are easily met and your mind remains tranquil. He also specifically targeted the fear of death, arguing that since we are just atoms that disperse when we die, we won't be around to experience death, so why fear it?
But the most resilient and famous of these mental armor philosophies was Stoicism. Thinkers like Epictetus, who was born a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, who was the most powerful emperor of Rome.
Talk about different backgrounds.
Completely different. Yet they both arrived at the exact same conclusion. The core of human peace is the dichotomy of control.
The idea that you must brutally divide the world into two categories, things that are up to you and things that are not up to you.
Precisely. Your opinions, your impulses, your desires, your moral choices, those are up to you. Your physical health, your wealth, your reputation, the weather, what other people say about you, those are not up to you.
Okay.
The Stoics argued that 100% of human misery comes from tying your happiness to things in that second category.
I always have to stop and question this when I read the Stoics.
Yeah.
Because on paper, it sounds flawless. But in practice, if I lose my job or someone I love gets terribly sick, and they just treat it with total emotional distance, saying, well, it's outside my control, isn't that just a fancy form of repressing my trauma? How is that healthy?
It's the most common critique of Stoicism, but it relies on a misunderstanding of what they meant by apathy. They weren't advocating for cold, robotic emotionlessness.
They weren't.
No. Stoicism is about active, real-time reasoning. It's about recognizing the space between a stimulus and your response. When a crisis hits, you will feel the initial shock that is a biological reality.
Right.
But the Stoic trains themselves to pause in that exact moment and ask, is the outcome of this within my direct control? If it isn't, they actively choose not to add secondary suffering to the situation by panicking or raging against reality. They focus solely on how they can respond with virtue.
It's not ignoring the storm, it's making sure you don't sink your own boat while you're in it.
Exactly.
And then you had the skeptics, who took mental protection from a totally different angle. They achieved tranquility by suspending judgment entirely. a practice they called epike.
Yes.
They realized that defending a rigid worldview requires constant, exhausting mental energy. If you simply accept that you cannot know anything for certain, you drop the burden of needing to be right.
This profound desire to escape the cycle of suffering wasn't just happening in the Mediterranean. It was the central focus of Indian philosophy during the same era.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at Jainism, an ancient Indian tradition built on the absolute commitment to ahimsa, or radical nonviolence. Jainism operates on the belief that every living entity, humans, animals, insects, even microscopic organisms, possesses an eternal soul.
And because of the mechanics of karma, any violence you commit against another soul literally weighs down your own soul, trapping you in the cycle of rebirth.
Right.
Jain monks take this so seriously that they will gently sweep the path in front of them as they walk so they don't accidentally step on a beetle. They wear masks over their mouths to avoid inhaling gnats. It is an entire ethical system built on supreme, meticulous gentleness.
And out of the same intellectual soil comes Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. He abandoned his life as a sheltered prince, confronted the brutal realities of sickness, aging, and death, and eventually formulated the Four Noble Truths.
Let's unpack those.
First, that life involves inescapable suffering, or dukkha. Second, that this suffering is caused by craving and attachment to things that are impermanent.
Which perfectly echoes the Stoics. Suffering comes from clinging to things you cannot hold on to.
Exactly. The third truth is that there is a way to end the suffering by extinguishing that craving. And the fourth is the Eightfold Path, a practical guide of ethical and mental disciplines to reach nirvana.
Right.
The Buddha rejected extreme asceticism, like starving oneself, and rejected extreme luxury, advocating instead for the middle way.
As Buddhism and other Indian philosophies evolved, they dug incredibly deeply into the nature of the self. Advaita Vedanta is a school of Hindu philosophy that posits an idea called non-duality.
Non-duality, yeah.
They argue that the boundary between you and the external universe is a complete hallucination. Your inner conscious witness, the Atman, is not just connected to, but is literally identical to the ultimate infinite reality of the universe, Brahman.
This exploration of consciousness reaches a stunning depth in Tibetan Buddhism. They develop the concept of the clear light nature of mind.
I love this concept.
They propose that beneath the relentless, turbulent storm of our daily anxieties, memories, and desires, the mind itself is fundamentally pure, luminous, and clear. Meditation, in this context, isn't about forcibly crushing your thoughts into silence.
Which is what everyone thinks meditation is.
Right. But it's actually about relaxing your focus until you can recognize the vast, open sky of awareness that exists behind the temporary clouds of emotion.
So humanity slowly figures out how to build this mental armor. We learn to find inner peace amidst the chaos, but human curiosity is relentless. Eventually, simply surviving the chaos isn't enough. We want to know the source code behind the chaos.
We always want to know more.
We elevate from seeking personal peace to seeking the ultimate universal truth. We try to decode the divine.
This marks our transition into the medieval period and the Islamic Golden Age. During this era, philosophy becomes deeply intertwined with theology. It is the monumental effort to reconcile religious devotion and revelation with the rigorous logic pioneered by the Greeks.
We see the seeds of this in the 3rd century CE with Plotinus. He takes Plato's ideas and develops Neoplatonism. He argues that the entire universe emanates from a single, absolute, incomprehensible source that he simply calls the One.
It's an elegant idea.
It's like a blinding flame and the dark existence radiates outward from it, and the further away from the flame you get, the colder and more material things become.
And this framework becomes incredibly useful for early Christian thinkers like St. Augustine. Augustine takes this Greek philosophical architecture and uses it to construct a robust Christian theology.
He writes the city of God, right?
Yes, contrasting the eternal divine realm with the flawed, temporary city of man. He speaks of the restless heart of humanity, arguing that our constant, agonizing desires can never be satisfied by physical things because we were designed to seek the infinite.
But Augustine's most brilliant philosophical maneuver is how he solves the problem of evil.
Oh, this is a big one.
If God is entirely good and created everything, where did evil come from? Augustine argues that God didn't create evil because evil isn't an actual, tangible thing. Evil is merely a privation, a lack of goodness.
It's like a shadow.
Exactly. It functions exactly like darkness. You can't measure darkness. Darkness is just a word we use to describe the absence of light. Evil is just the absence of God's order.
It's a profound synthesis of logic and faith. And thousands of miles away, in 12th century China, Neo-Confucianism was undergoing a similar synthesis, tying human ethics directly to cosmic forces.
With thinkers like Zhu Xi.
Yes. Zhu Xi took the ancient concepts of Confucius and mapped them onto a metaphysical structure. He argued that everything in the universe is a combination of Li and Qi.
Li being the underlying invisible blueprint or rational pattern of reality, and Qi being the vital physical energy or material force that fills that blueprint.
Correct. So for a Neo-Confucian, studying ethics and behaving properly wasn't just about societal manners anymore. By aligning your behavior with moral principles, you were literally harmonizing your personal Qi with the cosmic Li of the universe.
But if we want to talk about the grand harmonization of ideas, we have to talk about the House of Wisdom in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. This is one of the most exciting intellectual periods in human history.
Oh, without a doubt.
It wasn't just a library, it was an industrial-scale translation movement. Scholars were taking ancient texts from Greece, Persia, and India, and painstakingly translating them into Arabic. They were facilitating a cross-cultural conversation that essentially saved the legacy of human thought.
And out of this rich cosmopolitan environment emerged towering polymaths like Avicenna in the 11th century. Avicenna was a master of Aristotle's logic, and he used it to make a vital distinction that would shape centuries of theology.
The difference between essence and existence. Let's define that. Essence is what a thing is its definition. I can know the essence of a unicorn. I know it's a horse with a horn. Existence is whether that thing actually operates in reality. And I know unicorns don't have existence.
Exactly. Avicenna argued that for every physical object, its essence is separate from its existence. A mountain doesn't have to exist. But by tracking the chain of cause and effect backward, he argued there must logically be one entity whose very essence is existence.
A necessary being.
Yes, a necessary being that cannot not exist, providing the foundation for everything else. This, he deduced, is God.
Avicenna also gave us one of the most surreal and brilliant thought experiments of the era, the floating man.
It's so trippy.
He asked his readers to imagine a person who is created fully formed in midair. This person is suspended in a void. They have no sight, no hearing, no smell. Their fingers cannot touch each other. They have absolutely zero sensory input from the physical world.
And Avicenna asks, would the suspended, sensory-deprived persons still know that they exist? His answer is an absolute yes. They would possess a direct, undeniable awareness of their own self. And since this awareness doesn't rely on the physical body or the physical senses, Avicenna argued he had logically proven that the human soul, or the mind, is a distinct immaterial entity.
It's incredibly elegant. But here is where it gets really, really interesting. The logic engine of the Islamic Golden Age hits a massive speed bump named Al-Ghazali.
He really throws a wrench in things.
He looks at philosophers like Avicenna and says, "You are getting way too confident in human reason." He writes a blistering critique called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and his primary target is the concept of cause and effect.
Al-Ghazali challenges the bedrock of scientific observation. We observe that when we touch fire to paper, the paper burns. Aristotle and Avicenna would say the fire causes the burning because it is in the nature of fire to do so.
Right.
Al-Ghazali says, no, you do not observe a necessary connection. You only observe two events happening in sequence. He argues that fire doesn't have to burn paper. It only burns paper because God actively wills it to happen in that exact moment.
Wait, really?
Yes. God usually does it out of habit, which creates the illusion of natural laws, but God could choose otherwise at any second.
I have to challenge this, because if we accept Al-Ghazali's premise that fire doesn't actually have to burn paper, doesn't the entirety of the scientific method instantly disintegrate? If there are no fixed physical laws, how can we predict anything?
It is a devastating philosophical strike. But Al-Ghazali wasn't an anti-intellectual trying to destroy science. He was attempting to inject profound humility into philosophy. He was pointing out that human reason cannot dictate limits to divine omnipotence.
But it caused a massive crisis, right?
Absolutely. Later thinkers had to urgently stitch faith and empirical observation back together.
Right, like Averroes in the Islamic world and Maimonides in the Jewish intellectual tradition. They had to figure out how to let God be God without breaking physics.
Averroes argued that when religious scripture contradicts obvious physical science, it means we are misreading the scripture. It should be taken metaphorically, not literally. Philosophy and theology are just two different paths up the exact same mountain of truth.
And Maimonides championed the concept of negative theology. He argued that human language is too weak and flawed to ever accurately describe what God is. If you say God is powerful, you are reducing God to human concepts of power.
That makes sense.
Instead, we can only safely state what God is not. God is not physical, God is not finite, God is not ignorant. This preserved the infinite mystery of the divine while leaving the physical world open for rational, scientific exploration.
And as these texts filter into Christian Europe, this exact tension gives birth to scholasticism. Medieval universities become battlegrounds of rigorous, hyper-structured debate. The superstar of this era is Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas is monumental.
He takes the massive, complex body of Aristotle's logic and painstakingly marries it to Christian theology.
Aquinas believed that faith and reason were two harmonious tools given by God. He developed his famous 5 ways, 5 logical arguments for the existence of God, derived not from blind faith, but from observable facts in the physical world.
Like what?
For example, he observed that everything in motion is put into motion by something else, but this chain cannot go backward infinitely. Therefore, there must be a first mover who initiated the cascade without being moved itself.
It's a breathtaking architectural structure of logic. But whenever you build systems that complex, they eventually get bogged down. The debates in the universities got so granular and convoluted that someone had to come along and clean it up.
Enter William of Ockham.
Yes, a Franciscan friar who gives us one of those powerful analytical tools in history, Occam's razor.
Occam argued that when you are presented with multiple hypotheses that explain a phenomenon, the hypothesis that requires the fewest assumptions is almost always the correct one. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity.
It is like forcefully decluttering a messy digital hard drive.
I love that comparison.
Let's say you walk into your living room and the lamp won't turn on. You could invent a theory that invisible, multidimensional energy beings have infiltrated your house and are absorbing the electrical currents. That theory does explain why the lamp is off.
It does.
But it requires you to assume the existence of dimensions, energy beings, and their desire to mess with your living room. Or you could hypothesize that the filament in the bulb broke. Both explain the dark room. Occam says delete the multidimensional beings from your cognitive hard drive. Stick to the simplest file. It's a ruthless tool for cutting through intellectual noise.
And that ruthless desire to cut away the unnecessary baggage eventually shatters the delicate, God-centered balance of the medieval world. Humanity decides it is time to pivot.
We stop obsessing over the architecture of heaven.
Right. And decide to put the human mind back at the center of the universe.
Which brings us to the Renaissance and the human-centric pivot. We transition from decoding the divine to decoding human potential. Renaissance humanists turn their gaze to the classical texts of Greece and Rome, emphasizing the dignity, agency, and creative power of individuals right here in the physical world.
And nobody observed the gritty, unvarnished reality of the human world more ruthlessly than Niccolò Machiavelli. He writes The Prince, a manual for political leadership that completely severs ethics from politics.
For Machiavelli, political philosophy was always about how a leader should be virtuous, just, and pious.
It was very idealistic.
Machiavelli looks at history and says, that's a fantasy that will get you killed. He essentially invents real politics. He argues that a ruler's only real job is to maintain the stability of the state. If being honest and kind achieves that, great.
But if lying, breaking treaties, and executing your rivals keeps the state from collapsing into civil war, then cruelty isn't just an option, it is the leader's duty. Machiavelli replaced traditional moral virtue with a concept he called virtu, which meant martial prowess, strategic brilliance, and adaptability. A leader must be like a lion to frighten the wolves and a fox to recognize the traps.
It's a shocking secularization of power. And simultaneously, you have the Protestant Reformation tearing down the religious power structures. Thinkers like Martin Luther argue against the absolute authority of the church hierarchy, insisting that the individual has direct, unmediated access to divine truth through their own conscience and scripture.
This systemic dismantling of old authorities creates a massive power vacuum, but it also creates the perfect environment for the scientific revolution. When you no longer have to blindly trust ancient texts, you can look through a telescope.
Like Copernicus and Galileo.
Yes, and later Isaac Newton. They proved that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and that the cosmos operates on cold, calculable, mechanical laws.
To make sense of this new mechanical universe, Francis Bacon steps up and formalizes the scientific method. He argues for inductive reasoning. Instead of starting with a grand theory and looking for proof, you start by gathering hundreds of specific, isolated facts and slowly build your way up to a general law.
It was a whole new way of thinking.
And he warns us to clear our minds of biases, which he called the idols of the mind, like how humans naturally see patterns where none exist.
But if Bacon wanted to clear the mind of biases, René Descartes wanted to burn the mind down to its foundations and rebuild it from scratch.
Radical doubt.
Exactly. Descartes looked at the rapid scientific changes and realized that everything he had been taught could be wrong. To find a solid foundation for knowledge, he systematically doubted everything. He doubted his teachers, he doubted his senses, because he knew they could be tricked by illusions.
He even doubted his own body, wondering if he was trapped in a dream or being deceived by an evil demon.
Right. He strips away literally every assumption until he hits absolute bedrock. He realizes there is one thing he cannot doubt: the fact that he is doubting. And if he is doubting, he is thinking. And if there is a thought, there must be a thinker.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
It is the ultimate intellectual anchor. But from that anchor, Descartes creates a massive philosophical headache: mind-body dualism. He argued that the mind, a non-physical thinking thing, and the body, a physical extended thing, are two completely different substances.
How the invisible mind pulls the levers of the physical brain became a problem that haunts philosophy to this day.
And Baruch Spinoza looks at Descartes' dualism and thinks it's completely illogical. How can two totally different substances interact? So Spinoza solves it by unifying everything. He argues there is only one infinite substance in the entire universe. He calls it God, or nature.
Spinoza's universe is breathtakingly holistic. Every star, every rock, every thought you have, every person on Earth is simply a temporary modification of this single infinite substance. But the catch is that this universe is entirely deterministic. There is no free will in the way we traditionally understand it. Everything unfolds according to the strict, necessary laws of nature.
So wait, if everything is determined by the laws of nature, what is the point of human life?
Right, that's the big question.
For Spinoza, true freedom isn't the ability to make spontaneous, uncaused choices. True freedom is achieving a rational understanding of why things happen. When you understand the vast web of cause and effect, you stop being a slave to sudden passions like anger or grief. You accept reality as it logically must be.
While Spinoza is trying to unify the cosmos, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke are trying to figure out how to keep humans from killing each other in the new secular era. They both use the concept of the state of nature, a hypothetical time before governments existed, but they arrive at opposite conclusions.
Hobbes, having lived through the bloody English Civil War, had a dark view of human nature. He wrote Leviathan, arguing that the state of nature was a war of every man against every man, where life was nasty, brutish, and short.
Sounds awful.
It was. To escape this constant terror, humans rationally agreed to a social contract. We winningly surrender our absolute freedom to a sovereign, a Leviathan, who wields terrifying power to enforce order.
Locke looks at the exact same hypothetical state of nature and sees something different. He thinks humans are generally reasonable and capable of cooperation. He believes we possess inalienable natural rights: life, liberty, and property.
For Locke, the social contract isn't a surrender to a dictator, it's the hiring of a manager. We create governments solely to protect our natural rights and mediate disputes. If the government oversteps and starts violating those rights, the contract is broken, and the citizens have the moral right to overthrow the sovereign.
It's the philosophical equivalent of a group project.
How so?
While Hobbes thinks that without a terrifying authoritarian boss breathing down everyone's neck, the group will descend into chaotic infighting and fail. Locke thinks the group naturally knows how to collaborate. They just elect a project manager for efficiency, and if the manager starts stealing their work, they have the right to fire him.
That is a very apt modern translation. And while political philosophy is busy writing the blueprints for modern democracies, metaphysics takes a sharp turn toward the bizarre.
Oh, Leibniz.
Yes, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz tries to reconcile the mechanical universe with a benevolent God. He proposes that the universe is made of infinite non-physical points of energy he called monads. They don't interact, but God has perfectly pre-established their harmony. Because of this, Leibniz claimed we must be living in the best of all possible worlds.
Which Voltaire hilariously mocks later, because clearly the world is full of suffering.
Clearly.
But Leibniz looks tame compared to George Berkeley. Berkeley develops subjective idealism. He makes the famous claim, esse est percipi, to be perceived.
Berkeley argued that physical matter, as an independent substance outside of our minds, simply does not exist. All that exists are minds and their perceptions. When you look at an apple, you are experiencing the color red, the crisp texture, the sweet taste. But if you take away the perceptions, there is no invisible matter left behind.
I have to laugh at this. It is the ultimate manifestation of main character syndrome. He is literally arguing that if I close my eyes and walk out of the room ceases to exist because I'm not looking at it. Why did history take this seriously?
Because Berkeley wasn't a solipsist, he didn't think the universe disappeared when he blinked. He argued that the universe remains stable because the infinite mind of God is always perceiving everything.
Oh, I see.
Berkeley was launching a desperate defense of religion. He saw the new materialistic science and realized that if the universe is just cold, dead matter operating on math, God becomes irrelevant. By arguing that reality is entirely mental, he made God the immediate necessary author of every single experience.
It's a brilliant defense, but it inadvertently opened a Pandora's box, because along comes the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume takes Berkeley's intense focus on human perception and uses it to violently tear down our confidence in literally everything.
Hume was a radical empiricist. He believed that all human knowledge must trace back to direct sensory experience. If you can't point to the sensory impression that created an idea, that idea is meaningless.
And Hume aims this weapon directly at the concept of cause and effect. He looks at a billiard table. One ball rolls across the felt, hits a second ball, and the second ball moves. Everyone, from Aristotle to Newton, says the first ball caused the second to move.
But Hume says, look closer. What did your eyes actually see? You saw a white ball move, you heard a clicking sound, and you saw a red ball move. You never actually saw the invisible force of causation. You just saw one event follow another.
Hume argues that causation is just a psychological habit. Because we've seen the sun rise every morning of our lives, our brains lazily assume there's a hidden law guaranteeing it will rise tomorrow. But logically, we have no proof. We are just creatures of habit.
He didn't stop at physics either. Hume turned his empiricism inward and demolished the concept of the self.
The self.
Yes. When you look inside your own mind, do you ever perceive a solid, unchanging you? No. You perceive a fleeting sensation of hunger, followed by a memory of yesterday, followed by a feeling of warmth. Hume argued that we are just a bundle of rapidly shifting perceptions. The solid self is a grammatical illusion.
So Hume basically burns the house down. If cause and effect are just habits, then science is shaky. If the self is an illusion, how can we hold criminals accountable for their past actions? We are in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution is exploding, society is becoming massively complex, and Hume has left us with no philosophical anchor.
It was a full-blown crisis.
This launches us into a period of desperate reconstruction. We need to rebuild morality, freedom, and the systemic structures of society.
We enter the Enlightenment, an era defined by the demand for universal reason. And one of the most vital interventions here comes from Mary Wollstonecraft. She looked at the Enlightenment thinkers who were preaching liberty, equality, and the power of human reason, and she pointed out their glaring systemic hypocrisy.
They were entirely excluding half the human race.
Exactly. In her vindication of the rights of woman, she completely dismantled the prevalent idea that women were naturally less rational or overly emotional. She argued that if women appeared less intellectually capable, it was solely because society had systematically denied them access to education and forced them into superficial societal roles.
She demanded that the universal principles of the Enlightenment actually be applied universally.
It was a groundbreaking application of logic to social justice. And on the metaphysical front, Immanuel Kant stepped up to rescue human knowledge from Hume's destructive skepticism.
Kant agreed with Hume that all our knowledge begins with sensory experience, right?
He did, but he argued it doesn't end there.
Kant executed what he called his Copernican revolution in philosophy. Instead of assuming our minds passively record the external world like a camera, Kant argued that the human mind actively shapes and constructs reality. Space, time, and the rules of cause and effect aren't floating out there in the universe. They are the fixed lenses built into human consciousness.
We can never know the thing in itself, the unvarnished reality behind our perceptions, but because all human minds share these same built-in lenses, we can still do objective science.
And Kant applies this same demand for universal structural logic to morality. He despised the idea that morality was based on fluctuating human emotions or the pursuit of happiness. He wanted ironclad, mathematically precise moral laws. This led to his famous categorical imperative.
The rule is act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law.
Meaning, before you do something, ask yourself, would it be logically sustainable if every single person on Earth did this?
Precisely. Take lying. If you make a false promise to get out of trouble and you universalize that action, then everyone lies all the time. If everyone lies, the very concept of a promise becomes meaningless. The logic collapses on itself. Therefore, lying is categorically immoral.
But this is where I have to push back on Kant's rigidity. Let's use the classic thought experiment. You are hiding an innocent person in your basement? A murderer knocks on your front door and asks, is the person hiding in your house?
The famous murderer at the door.
Right. According to Kant's strict universalizability, is there truly no situation where a lie is morally permissible?
For Kant, the answer is an uncompromising no. You cannot lie to the murderer. Because if you make an exception for yourself, you destroy the rational structure of morality. You are responsible for doing your rational duty telling the truth. You are not responsible for the unpredictable consequences that follow.
That feels incredibly cold and detached from the reality of human suffering, which is exactly why the English philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill developed utilitarianism. They looked at Kant's rigid rules and said, morality isn't about logical consistency, it's about making the world a better place.
Utilitarianism shifts the focus entirely to the consequences of an action. Bentham argued that humans are governed by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Therefore, the ethically right action is whatever produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people.
So the utilitarian looks at the murderer at the door, quickly calculates the pain of telling a lie versus the horrific pain of an innocent person being killed, and concludes that lying isn't just permissible, it is your absolute moral obligation.
Exactly. And John Stuart Mill refined this calculus by introducing the harm principle. He recognized that the greatest number could easily become a tyranny of the majority that crushes minority rights.
That makes sense.
Mill argued that society should only limit an individual's freedom if their actions are actively causing harm to someone else. Otherwise, individual liberty is paramount.
But while the British were mathematically calculating units of happiness, the German idealists, thinkers like Fichte, Schelling, and primarily Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, were going incredibly deep into the flow of history.
Hegel looked at history not as a random series of events, but as the inevitable evolution of a world spirit, or Geist, gradually realizing its own freedom. And the engine driving this historical evolution is the dialectic.
The dialectic is such a powerful concept. It posits that progress only happens through conflict. You start with a status quo, a thesis. Over time, the internal flaws of that thesis generate a reaction, its opposite, an antithesis. They clash, and out of the wreckage emerges a synthesis, a new, elevated state that preserves the truths of both while discarding their errors.
You can see it in history. The absolute monarchy of the French thesis provoked the violent, chaotic antithesis of the French Revolution. The bloody clash eventually synthesized into modern constitutional democracies.
It's like a musical mashup. You take a classical violin piece, the thesis, and you smash it together with heavy metal drums, the antithesis. At first, it's just jarring conflict, but if you manipulate them correctly, they synthesize into an entirely new, evolved genre of music. Hegel saw all of human reality moving forward through this clash.
But not everyone was thrilled with this grand, rational march of history. The Romantic nature philosophers reacted violently against the cold mechanics of the Enlightenment and the rigid systems of Hegel. They argued that nature isn't a dead machine to be categorized. It is a living, striving organism, deeply connected to human emotion, intuition, and artistic genius.
And out of this romantic focus on hidden drives comes Arthur Schopenhauer. He looks at the striving force of nature and decides, actually, this is a nightmare.
He was famously pessimistic.
Schopenhauer posits that the foundational reality of the universe isn't a rational mind. It is a blind, irrational, endless craving that he called the will.
For Schopenhauer, humans are just manifestations of this will. We are constantly driven by desires for food, for status, for love. When we lack what we desire, we suffer from the pain of absence. When we finally get what we want, we quickly become bored and desire something new. Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom.
It's an incredibly pessimistic worldview.
Yeah.
But he did offer a way out. He argued that we can temporarily escape the tyranny of the will by losing ourselves in profound aesthetic experiences, like listening to a symphony, or by practicing deep, selfless compassion for others, recognizing that we are all suffering together in this meat grinder of desire.
This focus on deep, personal angst influenced the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard attacked the grand systemic philosophy of Hegel. He argued that you cannot capture the terrifying reality of human existence in a neat, logical flowchart.
Kierkegaard shifts the spotlight entirely onto the subjective, individual experience. He zeroes in on existential angst, the dizzying, nauseating realization of our own total freedom to choose.
He argued that logic and science cannot tell you how to live or what is truly meaningful. At some point, the evidence runs out and you are forced to make a leap of faith. True, authentic living requires making passionate, subjective commitments to your life choices, even in the face of absolute objective uncertainty.
While Kierkegaard was exploring the spiritual struggles of the individual, Karl Marx was exploring the material struggles of the masses.
Yes, Marx.
Marx completely inverted Hegel. Hegel thought ideas drove history. Marx argued that economics and material conditions drive history. Now, we're just laying out his framework impartially here, right?
Of course. Marx analyzed history through the lens of class conflict. During the Industrial Revolution, he saw a stark divide between the bourgeoisie who owned the factories and capital and the proletariat who only owned their own physical labor.
Marx observed that capitalism structurally required the worker to produce more value than they were paid in wages. He also wrote powerfully about alienation. A craftsman making a whole chair feels connected to his work, but a factory worker pulling the same lever 10,000 times a day to produce a single part of a machine they will never own becomes alienated from their own labor, treating themselves simply as a biological machine.
Whether one agrees with his solutions or not, Marx's analytical frameworks profoundly reshaped how we view economics and power dynamics.
And as the 19th century progressed, the frameworks for understanding humanity were repeatedly shattered. Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, detailing the theory of evolution by natural selection.
This was a massive philosophical earthquake. For centuries, humans believed they were divinely separate from the animal kingdom, placed on Earth with a special, transcendent purpose. Darwin proves that we are simply part of the biological continuum. We are advanced primates shaped by the brutal, random pressures of environmental adaptation.
This realization amplified the crisis of meaning. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky brilliantly captured this tension. In works like Notes from Underground and The Brothers Karamazov, he explored the war between cold, utilitarian reason and the messy, irrational human soul.
Dostoevsky showed that humans are not rational calculators. Sometimes we will intentionally act destructively, sabotaging our own happiness, simply to prove to ourselves that we have free will and are not just piano keys being played by the laws of nature.
Dostoevsky highlighted the crushing, agonizing burden of freedom. And this century of upheaval culminates in the explosive thought of Friedrich Nietzsche. When Nietzsche famously wrote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," he was not doing a celebratory victory dance.
No, he was sounding a terrifying alarm. Nietzsche recognized that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution had functionally removed God as the foundation for objective truth. But society was still coasting on the fumes of Christian morality. He warned that when the masses finally realized the foundation was gone, society would descend into nihilism, the belief that nothing matters.
To survive the death of God, Nietzsche said we must evolve. We must become the Übermensch, the Overman. The Übermensch doesn't look to the sky for objective moral rules. They boldly create their own values in a chaotic world. They embrace the will to power, which isn't about violently dominating others, but about mastering oneself, overcoming adversity, and transforming one's own life into a beautiful, self-authored work of art.
So the 19th century ends with a profound dismantling. Nietzsche smashes the old moral tablets, Darwin places us back in the mud with the animals, and Marx exposes the hidden economic machinery controlling our lives.
The 20th century rolls around, the dust settles, philosophers look at the wreckage of absolute truth, and they ask what is actually left to trust. And the answer they find is profoundly unsettling. They realize that language, power structures, and the unconscious mind have secretly been controlling what we arrogantly believed was objective reality.
We have to dive into the deconstruction of the modern mind.
Let's start with how we process truth. In America, we see the rise of pragmatism. Thinkers like William James and John Dewey argued that philosophers had wasted centuries arguing over abstract, perfect definitions of truth. Jones argued that the truth of an idea is determined solely by its cash value.
Does the idea work in practice? Does it help you navigate the physical world successfully? If an idea makes no practical difference in how you live, arguing about it is meaningless.
It's a very practical, action-oriented philosophy. But our ability to take rational action gets completely derailed by Sigmund Freud. Freud drops a psychological bomb on the 20th century by mapping out the unconscious mind.
Before Freud, the assumption was that you are the master of your own mind. Freud argued that your conscious, rational awareness, the ego, is just the tiny tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface is the massive, roiling id, filled with primal, socially unacceptable drives for sex and aggression.
And pressing down on the id is the superego, the internalized, restrictive moral rules of society.
Freud argued that we constantly repress these dark primal urges because society tells us they are bad. But repressed energy doesn't disappear. It sneaks out through the back door as neuroses, anxiety, slips of the tongue, and bizarre dreams. Freud showed us that we are strangers in our own minds, driven by forces we neither see nor control.
While Freud is plunging into the messy, irrational depths of the unconscious, early analytic philosophers are moving in the exact opposite direction. Thinkers like Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell were disgusted by the sloppy, poetic language of 19th century philosophy. They wanted to make philosophy as clean, rigorous, and unambiguous as mathematics. They developed symbolic logic to analyze the precise structure of language and arguments.
Simultaneously, Edmund Husserl is trying to rescue our direct experience of reality. He develops phenomenology. Husserl noticed that science was becoming so abstract that it was alienating us from our actual lives.
To fix this, Husserl introduced the concept of bracketing. When you look at an object like a tree, your brain instantly loads up scientific assumptions. You think about photosynthesis, cellular structure, biological categories.
Husserl said we need to put all those scientific and cultural assumptions in brackets, set them aside, and study the pure, immediate phenomenon of the tree exactly as it appears to our consciousness. He wanted to return philosophy to the raw data of lived experience.
The need to rethink reality was accelerated by the hard sciences. Albert Einstein proves the theory of relativity. Suddenly, space and time are no longer fixed, objective boxes that the universe sits inside. They are a flexible fabric that bends and warps depending on the speed and gravitational perspective of the observer. The observer is inextricably linked to the reality they are observing.
And Martin Heidegger takes this concept of contextual reality and applies it to human existence. In his masterwork, Being in Time, he introduces the concept of Dasein, which translates to being there. Heidegger argued that previous philosophers treated humans as isolated minds staring at objects. But we are never isolated. We're always thrown into a world deeply entangled in a web of cultural contexts, tools, and relationships.
Heidegger also argued that we spend most of our time avoiding the one absolute truth of our existence, our own death. We distract ourselves with trivial chatter and societal expectations. He claimed that we only achieve true authenticity when we confront our mortality head-on and live resolutely toward death, realizing that our time is finite and our choices are entirely our own.
This deep existential focus was fiercely rejected by the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 30s. They were strict empiricists. They created the verification principle, which stated that any sentence that cannot be verified by empirical scientific observation or mathematical logic is literally strictly meaningless.
Which means if you say, the soul is immortal or lying is evil, the positivists would say you aren't making a factual claim, you're just making emotional noises. But Karl Popper looks at this strict verification rule and realizes it actually destroys science. Because you can never fully verify a universal law. You can observe a million white swans, but that doesn't definitively prove the statement, all swans are white.
Exactly. Popper revolutionizes the philosophy of science by shifting the focus from verification to falsifiability. He argued that for a theory to be genuinely scientific, it must make bold, specific predictions that could be proven wrong by observation. All swans are white is a great scientific hypothesis because finding just one black swan destroys it. Real science actively tries to falsify its own claims. Pseudoscience just continuously looks for confirmations.
And then the philosopher W.V.O. Quine comes in and destroys the neat boundaries between our theories. He introduces the concept of the web of belief. He argued that we don't test single, isolated facts against reality. All our knowledge is a massive interconnected web. The hard facts of physics are at the core, and everyday historical or cultural beliefs are at the edges.
If a new observation contradicts the web, we don't throw away the whole web. We just adjust the strands, tweaking our theories to accommodate the new data. Truth is a holistic ecosystem.
The malleability of truth is perhaps best demonstrated by Ludwig Wittgenstein's radical shift in how we understand language. Early in his career, he thought language was a logical picture of facts. But later, he completely reversed his view and introduced the concept of language games.
This is a great concept.
It is. Wittgenstein argued that words do not have fixed, dictionary-perfect essences. Meaning is derived entirely from how a word is used in a specific social context. He uses the word game as an example. Try to come up with a strict definition of the word game that perfectly includes a competitive soccer match, a culinary game of solitaire, and a child throwing a ball against a wall, but successfully excludes a political debate or a war.
It is impossible. There is no single common feature. Instead, Wittgenstein noted they share an overlapping network of similarities, which he called family resemblances. Because language is fluid and contextual, many philosophical problems are actually just confusions caused by people playing different language games without realizing it.
And if meaning is created by social use, then whoever controls the society controls the meaning. This brings us to the Frankfurt School thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse. Again, reporting on their theories impartially here, they developed critical theory to analyze how modern society controls its citizens, not through secret police, but through culture.
They analyzed the culture industry. They observed that mass media, pop music, Hollywood movies, and relentless consumerism function as a sophisticated mechanism of social control. By keeping the working class constantly entertained, comfortably numb, and obsessed with buying consumer goods, the capitalist system pacifies radical thought and prevents genuine social critique.
This focus on underlying systems leads to structuralism. Thinkers like Ferdinand de Saussure in linguistics and Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology argued that you cannot understand human behavior by looking at individual events or objects. Meaning only exists within the hidden structures and relationships of a system. A stop sign doesn't mean stop because of its red color. It means stop only because it exists in a structural relationship of difference with a green light.
And Michel Foucault takes this analysis of hidden structures into the realm of power. Foucault was brilliant at showing how power operates in ways we don't even recognize as power. He wasn't interested in kings with armies, he was interested in disciplinary power.
Foucault looked at how society organizes bodies in space. He used the architectural concept of the panopticon, a prison design, where guards sit in a central tower and inmates are in a circle of backlit cells. The inmates can't see into the tower, so they never know exactly when they're being watched. Because they might be watched at any second, they internalize the surveillance and start policing their own behavior.
Foucault pointed out that modern society took this disciplinary structure and copied it everywhere. Schools, hospitals, psychiatric wards, factories, and military barracks all use the exact same mechanisms of strict scheduling, constant surveillance, and normalization to mold docile, obedient human bodies. Knowledge and power, for Foucault, are completely inseparable. The people who have the power dictate what gets classified as true or normal.
And taking deconstruction to its ultimate linguistic extreme, we have Jacques Derrida. He invents deconstruction, arguing that language is infinitely slippery. Words only have meaning by differing from other words, which means the ultimate final meaning of a text is constantly deferred. You can never nail it down. But I have to ask, if Foucault says all knowledge is just a power play and Derrida says language can't pin down objective meaning, how do we avoid complete intellectual collapse? How do we ever agree on a medical diagnosis or a historical fact?
It is the defining crisis of late 20th century thought. By synthesizing Quine's webs, Foucault's power dynamics, and Derrida's slippery language, philosophy taught us profound humility. We learned that facts are never pristine, they are always deeply entangled in human interpretation and power, but total collapse is avoided by leaning on Popper's lifeboat of falsifiability and the pragmatist's focus on cash value. We might never possess a pure, God's eye view of objective truth, but we can systematically weed out errors, test our theories against reality, and iteratively navigate closer to a functional understanding of the world.
And that humility was desperately needed when dealing with the legacy of history. Post-colonial voices like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Homi Bhabha stepped forward to point out that for centuries, the objective truth taught in European universities was actually just the subjective worldview of the colonizers. Said's concept of Orientalism mapped out how the West actively invented a distorted, exotic, and backward image of the Eastern world in literature and science to justify imperial rule. These thinkers profoundly reshaped our understanding of identity, showing how colonial power structures permanently alter the psychology of both the oppressed and the oppressor.
The 20th century systematically proved that our realities, our language, our power dynamics, our cultural assumptions are constructed. But if the scripts we've been handed are constructed, it means we are not bound by them. We are forced to step onto the empty stage and actively choose our values. This transition pulls us out of theory and into the deeply personal realm of existential choices and the ethical expanding circle.
Enter Jean-Paul Sartre. He drops a three-word manifesto that defines modern existentialism. Existence precedes essence. For a paper cutter, the essence, the idea of cutting paper, exists in the inventor's mind before the object is created. But for humans, Sartre argues, there is no divine inventor. We simply exist first. We are born into a meaningless universe, and we are forced to invent our own essence through our actions and choices.
It is a philosophy of radical, terrifying freedom. Sartre famously declared that we are condemned to be free, and if you try to escape the anxiety of this freedom by blaming your circumstances, your parents, or your societal role, Sartre says you are living in bad faith. You are pretending to be an unthinking object rather than a free agent.
His contemporary, Albert Camus, looked at this same meaningless universe and called it the absurd. Our human desire for meaning constantly clashes with the silent, indifferent universe. To illustrate how we should live, he used the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, repeating the futile task for eternity.
Camus argued that our daily lives are essentially the same repetitive, futile struggle, but the crucial moment is when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to retrieve the rock. In that moment of consciousness, he can choose to despise his fate, or he can embrace the struggle itself as his purpose. Camus concludes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy, defiant joy in the face of the absurd."
This existential focus on radical freedom was brilliantly applied to identity by Simone de Beauvoir. In The Second Sex, she famously wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." She argued that while biological sex is physical, the intricate rules of gender are entirely social constructs imposed by a patriarchal society.
And Judith Butler took this foundation decades later and introduced the concept of gender performativity. Butler argued that gender isn't an internal reality or something you are, it is something you do. It is the stylized repetition of acts, gestures, and clothing dictated by societal norms. And the incredibly empowering realization here is that if gender is a performance, the script can be rewritten. We can subvert and change the performance.
On a broader societal level, the struggle to define fairness generated the ultimate political debate of the late 20th century between two Harvard philosophers, John Rawls and Robert Nozick. Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice and argued that a just society is synonymous with fairness. To design a fair society, he invented a brilliant thought experiment called the Veil of Ignorance.
Rawls asks you to imagine that you are designing the rules, taxes, and laws of a new society, but you must do so from behind a veil of ignorance. You do not know what position you will hold in this new society. You don't know if you will be born incredibly wealthy or in grinding poverty. You don't know your race, your gender, or whether you will be perfectly healthy or severely disabled.
Rawls argues that if you are acting rationally from behind that veil, you will automatically design a society with a robust safety net. You will maximize the rights and resources of the worst-off people just in case you end up being one of them. It's a powerful justification for a strong welfare state and progressive taxation.
But his colleague Robert Nozick vehemently disagreed. Nozick countered with entitlement theory. He argued that if you acquire your wealth without defrauding or violently coercing anyone, you are absolutely entitled to keep it. For Nozick, when the state forcibly taxes your legitimately earned income to redistribute it to someone else, it is a violation of your fundamental liberty. It is a form of partial forced labor.
Looking at Rawls' original position behind the veil, it's a beautiful, empathetic thought experiment. But isn't Nozick tapping into a deeper, more stubborn psychological reality? Once the veil is lifted, won't people always feel an intense sense of entitlement to the specific fruits of their own personal labor, regardless of the systemic advantages they had?
You have just highlighted the unresolvable tension at the heart of modern democracy. How do we balance the collective moral demand for fairness with the individual's right to unhindered liberty? It is the question driving almost every modern political debate. But some thinkers, particularly in the feminist ethics of care movement, argued that both Rawls and Nozick were approaching it wrong. They argued that trying to reduce human morality to abstract, mathematical contracts ignores the messy reality of human life. Morality shouldn't just be about impartial justice. It must prioritize empathy, interpersonal relationships, and the contextual realities of caring for vulnerable, dependent people.
And as we reconsider how we treat the vulnerable, Peter Singer steps up and forcefully expands the moral circle. Singer, applying strict utilitarian logic, argues that the defining characteristic for moral consideration isn't human intelligence, it is the capacity to suffer. Therefore, he advocates forcefully for animal rights, arguing that the industrial suffering of animals in factory farms is a massive moral atrocity.
Singer also pioneered the framework behind effective altruism. He argues that we have a rigorous moral obligation to use evidence and logic to figure out how to do the absolute most good with our resources. If you have $1,000 to donate, giving it to your local art museum while children are dying of easily preventable malaria overseas is, according to Simmer, a moral failure. You must maximize the reduction of suffering.
And the deep ecology movement takes this expansion even further. They argue for biospheric egalitarianism. They reject the idea that nature only matters because it provides lumber or clean air for humans. Deep ecologists argue that a forest, a river, and an entire ecosystem have intrinsic value and a right to exist entirely independent of their usefulness to human beings.
This leads directly into the complexities of climate ethics, which forces us to grapple with a completely new philosophical problem: intergenerational justice. For the first time in history, the daily actions of our generation possess the technological scale to degrade the habitability of the planet for humans who will not be born for another 300 years. What moral obligations do we owe to people who do not yet exist?
And while ethics is expanding outward to the planet, the philosophy of mind is diving inward, getting incredibly trippy. Let's talk about the hard problem of consciousness. How does squishy physical brain matter produce the vivid subjective feeling of smelling coffee or feeling sadness? Panpsychism is gaining traction again, alongside theories like integrated information theory or IIT.
IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness isn't a magical ghost in the machine. It is a fundamental property of the universe, much like mass or gravity. IIT suggests that any physical system that integrates information has a degree of consciousness, which can mathematically be measured by a value called phi.
So a rock has 0 phi. But a complex neural network or a thermostat with basic feedback loops might possess a microscopic sliver of subjective experience. The universe might be humming with varying degrees of awareness.
As we try to map the consciousness of the physical universe, we are simultaneously migrating into deeply artificial ones. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard eerily predicted our modern condition when he wrote about hyperreality. He warned of a state where the simulation of reality replaces the real thing.
Baudrillard used Disneyland as his primary analogy. He argued that Disneyland exists not to be a fantasy world, but to convince adults that the sprawling, consumerist suburbs of Los Angeles outside the park are real.
Exactly. And today we see hyperreality everywhere. Look at social media. We construct highly curated, filtered simulations of our lives. Over time, the simulation becomes more important than the reality. The photograph of the vacation matters more than the subjective experience of the vacation. We live to service the aesthetic of the simulation.
And the cultural critic, Slavoj Žižek, points out that this entire hyperreal matrix is driven by ideology. We like to think we are cynical, free-thinking consumers, but Žižek argues that ideology structures our subconscious desires. We buy the ethically sourced organic coffee not because it changes the world, but because buying it functions as an indulgence that temporarily relieves our guilt about participating in global capitalism. The ideology is baked into our daily rituals.
With this overwhelming barrage of hyperreality, ideological manipulation, and endless connectivity, it is no wonder that the modern world has seen a massive resurgence of interest in Zen and mindfulness practices. Amidst the deafening noise of the 21st century, millions are turning to ancient techniques simply to sit still, regulate their breathing, and anchor their minds in the immediate, unmediated present moment. So we have expanded our ethical circle to include the entire biosphere, and we are desperately trying to ground our minds in a hyperreal culture. But now we are crossing the threshold into uncharted territory. We are facing the creation of entirely new, non-human entities and digital realities. This brings us to the climax of our historical journey, the final frontiers. The philosophical tools humanity built over 2.5 millennia are now colliding head-on with unprecedented technological realities.
One of the most pervasive frontiers is digital surveillance. The panopticon Foucault warned us about is now sitting in our pockets. We generate endless streams of data through our phones, smartwatches, and browsing habits. This creates an extreme tension between the desire for security and the necessity of freedom. Philosophers warn of the chilling effect. When human beings know their data is constantly monitored, evaluated, and stored, they unconsciously censor their own behavior, stifling dissent and creative deviation from the norm.
This data explosion has given birth to the philosophy of information. Thinkers are now arguing that the fundamental building block of reality isn't water, like Thales thought, or atoms, like Democritus thought. The fundamental nature of existence is information.
And we are using that informational building block to construct artificial intelligence. AI ethics is arguably the most urgent philosophical project in human history. We are encoding human biases into algorithmic black boxes that determine who gets a mortgage or who goes to jail.
And the responsibility gap is terrifying. If an autonomous driving AI makes a split-second calculation to swerve to avoid a crowd, but in doing so crashes and kills the passenger, who is morally at fault? The engineer who wrote the code 5 years ago, the corporate board, the AI itself. Our legal and moral frameworks require a conscious agent with intent, and AI shatters that framework.
The disruption doesn't stop at AI. Transhumanism is forcing us to question the biological limits of the human condition. With CRISPR gene editing, neuroenhancements, and brain-computer interfaces, we are steering our own evolution. We are looking at a post-human future. But this raises agonizing ethical questions about distributive justice. Will these enhancements be universal, or will we create a biological caste system where the ultra-rich literally engineer themselves into a superior, longer-living species?
And hovering over all of these technological leaps is the most mind-bending concept of our era, Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis. Bostrom applied statistical logic to our technological trajectory. He argued that if any advanced post-human civilization eventually gains the computing power to run perfectly realistic conscious simulations of their ancestors, they will likely run billions of them.
And mathematically, if there's one base reality and billions of simulated realities, the statistical probability that you and I are currently sitting in the one true base reality is practically zero?
It is the ultimate video game analogy. If we are truly living in a simulation, it forces you to look at the world differently. Maybe the people acting thoughtlessly in traffic around you are quite literally NPCs, non-playable characters running on low-level background scripts to save computing power. But seriously, what does this actually mean for how we live? If Bostrom is right, in this table, this microphone, and my own consciousness are just lines of code on a server in higher dimension, does it actually matter? Do I still have to pay my taxes to the simulation government?
It is a hilarious question, but it gets to the absolute core of metaphilosophy, the philosophy of how we use philosophy, and it loops us perfectly back to the American pragmatists. William James would look at the simulation hypothesis and ask, what is the cash value of this idea? If you decide not to pay your simulated taxes, the simulated government will send simulated police to put you in a simulated prison.
And the anxiety, the loss of freedom, and the psychological distress I experience in that prison will be 100% viscerally real to my conscious mind.
Precisely. Whether the universe is made of water, atoms, or digital code, your subjective experience of joy, suffering, and moral responsibility remains intensely real. This is why modern thinkers often find solace by returning to Mahayana Buddhism, particularly Nagarjuna's concept of emptiness, or shunyata. Nagarjuna argued that all phenomena are empty of independent, fixed essence, because everything only exists dependently in relation to everything else.
So even if the universe is a digital simulation, it is still a profound web of interconnected relationships. We are still bound to each other. We still have to navigate the middle way through the noise of modern life, acting with compassion and intention.
Which is why the continuous conversation of philosophy matters more now than ever.
Pulling the lens back out to you, the listener. What a massive, breathtaking journey we've just taken together. I want to thank you for sitting at the table with us today. When you step back and look at the whole tapestry, it is truly marvelous to reflect on how a guy looking at water in ancient Greece asking, what is the world made of? Slowly evolved, patch by patch, century by century, into modern engineers asking, how do we code a fair, ethical society into an artificial superintelligence? It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that philosophy isn't dead history. It is an ongoing, active, vital conversation that is shaping your reality right now.
And you are an active participant in it. Every time you navigate a moral dilemma, every time you cast a vote, every time you choose to buy a sustainable product, or even how you choose to curate your identity on social media, you are executing the philosophical patches written by generations before you.
It's your operating system.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We spend an enormous amount of time worrying about whether artificial intelligence will eventually turn on us and destroy humanity. But what if the ultimate philosophical question of the 21st century isn't about the mechanics of human consciousness at all? What if the real existential question is this? When we finally build an artificial superintelligence, which of these philosophers will we teach it to emulate?
Oh, wow.
Will we program the AI to be a strict Kantian, following absolute universal rules regardless of the context? Will we build it as a utilitarian, ruthlessly calculating the maximum survival outcomes at any cost? Or will it be a Machiavellian intelligence, doing whatever manipulative actions are necessary to maintain planetary order? The survival of our entire species might entirely depend on which dead philosopher wins that debate in the code of the future.
That is deeply chilling and so brilliantly put. We have gone from humanity's ancient, open-source attempts to understand the stars all the way to the literal source code of our species' future. And to think, this incredible intellectual landscape we traverse today was sourced from material designed to help people sleep. I hope we did the exact opposite for you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and keep diving deep into the sources around